To many people, climate change is no longer an abstract possibility. It is here. To others, that's hype, and measures such as carbon pricing are just cash grabs or worse. With us now to sort the fact from the fiction, in Victoria, BC, via Skype, Greg Flato, Senior Research Scientist at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Dianne Saxe, former Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, currently President of Saxe Facts. And Courtney Howard, Board President at the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and an emergency room physician in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. Welcome to you all. Before we start our discussion, let's take a look at a clip about how to talk about climate change. And this was produced by the Alliance for Climate Education. Please roll.
Talking about climate change can be tough. I mean, it's not like something you can just casually bring up in conversation. But it's such a big, important topic, we can't just ignore it. And while you can't fix climate change all by yourself, you do have the power to affect the people in your life. So let's talk more about climate change. Here's how. First, think about all the things you want to say about climate change, and don't say them. Really. You see, if you just start going off on how bad climate change is, people are probably going to shut down. They may feel attacked and put up their guard. It doesn't matter how eloquent your words are. If the other person's not listening, there's no point.
Dianne, I'd like to start with you. Your final report as the Environmental Commission of Ontario was accompanied by a letter to the Legislative Assembly in which you state, Ontario could be on the road to a clean economy, but is currently headed in the wrong direction. Right. In terms of recent changes in environmental policy, there you go, how are we headed in the wrong direction?
Oh, in almost every way. What we've seen a year ago, and I guess a few days, Ontario had a huge amount to be proud of. Internationally, we closed our coal plants, dramatically improving our air quality, reducing our pollution. We had a price on carbon. We were spending that money on building a clean economy. And now just about all the progress that we made in the previous decade has been damaged or destroyed. We don't have meaningful targets. We don't have a meaningful program to achieve those targets. We've slashed energy conservation. We have increased speed limits, doing everything we can to make gasoline cheaper. We're increasing sprawl, which is a major driver of climate pollution in Ontario. In practically every way, the provincial government is now pushing us into things that are going to increase our climate pollution when we have a desperate need to reduce it.
Well, you mentioned the provincial government. There have been a number of provincial elections across the country. There's a federal election coming up in October. Courtney, how concerned are you that when you see Canadians electing governments that are opposed to cap and trade or carbon tax initiatives?
So we know that climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century. That's what the World Health Organization, the Lancet, all our big journals tell us. And we also know we have to work in different disciplinary groups in order to make it work. So doctors can't solve it all by themselves. Economists can't solve it all by themselves. But when we work together, it works. So what the Lancet, a journal that is very sort of prestigious in medicine, has done is they've made these multidisciplinary groups that have come together to figure out, okay, well, what's the diagnosis and what's the best treatment? And so those groups, which include economists and doctors, have said, okay, well, taking action on climate change to improve people's health is the best reason for us to act. And our single best tool in our toolkit is carbon pricing. And so it's, knowing that one of the best treatments is being taken off the table by some of our politicians just makes me question whether we're going to be effective at solving our climate crisis.
And I think a lot of people are interested in knowing or wanting to know, because when we do cover climate change here, we do get a lot of feedback. And Greg, we have a viewer who gets in touch with us when we do cover climate change, and he often points out statements made by our guests that he considers to be alarmist and scientifically inaccurate. He also backs up his points with charts and graphics, including the one I'm about to show you, this one right here, which he accompanied with a statement, hotter days are not getting hotter. So what we're seeing here is a squiggly line charting the hottest day of each year in Ottawa, another line showing the average of those hot days, and a red line showing carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. Greg, what do you make of this data?
Well, it's a bit hard to know exactly what, the source of the data there is not clear to me. What we have done in a recently released report, the Canada's Changing Climate Report, is looked at a number of observationally based measures of climate change, including annual maximum hot days and cold days. The difficulty is that many of these quantities vary from place to place and have lots of natural variability from year to year. So extracting a signal that is really attributable to a changing climate on these individual point measurements is often very difficult. So what we do is look at averages across a larger region, a province or a country or the globe. And when you do that, then you can see much clearer signals of a changing climate. And if you average across Canada, you see that the average annual maximum daily temperature is increasing across Canada on average by about 0.6 degrees since 1948. If you look at an individual city, however, or individual measurement site, there's lots of ups and downs that are part of natural variability and are, it's difficult to tease out the part that is due to climate change versus the part that's due to natural variability.
And I think that graph, what it was showing was for the city of Ottawa. Why is that problematic to use as an example of the rest of Canada?
Well, it's not so much that it's problematic, but it is not necessarily representative of the rest of Canada. When you look at the observed warming across Canada, southeastern Ontario and the Maritimes have warmed less than many other parts of the country. If you look at a map of observed temperature change, the largest warming is up in the northwest of Canada, so Northwest Territories and Yukon have seen the largest increase in temperature, whereas if you look at eastern Canada, particularly southeastern Canada, you see smaller observed changes. And that's part of a global pattern where warming is not uniform. There's places in the world where where warming is larger and places where it's smaller. In general, it's larger as you go further north. So, the global mean has increased since pre-industrial times by about 1 degree Celsius. Canada, which is a northern country, has warmed about 2 degrees over that same period. And if you go to northern Canada in the Arctic, it's warmed more like 3 degrees. So those patterns have to be taken into account. And if you pick a spot where there's less warming, then of course you're going to see a smaller signal.
And Dianne, anything to add to that?
Well, absolutely. So as environmental commissioner, we did a lot of work looking at how temperature and precipitation have changed across Ontario. Mm-hmm. And what we saw was that Ottawa is one of the places that has warmed less. For example, we've got a chart here that shows how average temperatures and precipitation have changed in Ottawa, and you can see it's quite a bit warmer in Ottawa over the last few decades. But in terms of how Ottawa compares to the rest of the province, we looked at how growing seasons have changed, and there are parts of Ontario where the growing seasons have changed up to 13 days a decade. And Ottawa growing seasons have changed comparatively little. So if you're going to pick a place to look, Ottawa hasn't changed very much. And in terms of maximum temperatures, we don't know the source of the chart. Neither Greg or I were able to validate this listener's chart. But we did look at other kinds of data, and what we see is that if you take more statistically robust things such as how many days do we have when it's too hot for kids to be in school portables and still concentrate, well, there we see big increases. So Toronto used to have about 3 days a year of really, really hot, over 25 degrees a century ago. Now up to 13 days a year, and we're starting to see more and more of those days during the school year. So we are seeing real changes in extreme weather right here in Ontario, but it's not the same everywhere. And Ottawa happens to be one of those places that isn't warming as fast.
And Courtney, you are the president of the Canadian Physicians for the Environment. How do you respond to accusations of alarmism in the work that you do there?
So we actually don't get accused of that very often, but I think the basis of that is that it's all scary for people. And so, we're facing a situation, it's being called a crisis, it's being called an emergency. And when I work in the emergency department and I tell people that, they have a new diagnosis and it's, say it's cancer and, we're going to have to do this thing and that thing and that thing, nobody likes that information. It makes people feel sad, it makes them scared, it makes them wonder how they're going to have to change their lives. And it generates a lot of emotion in people. So, I think it's natural that the conversations around climate change elicit strong emotions in people. And I think instead of becoming so confrontational about it, I think it will be more helpful if we start to ask ourselves, where's that coming from? Because once we do that, I think it's a lot easier to have compassion for one another. It's about everybody needing to make changes in their lives so that they align with a path that will pull us forward together to a healthy future. And let's just have a conversation as humans instead of as sort of opponents. But at its base, I think it's just because everybody's scared.
Well, Dianne, in your final report to the Ontario Legislature, we find this statement. You wrote, Ontarians face behavioral, systemic, and market barriers to reducing energy waste and need supportive government action to overcome them. Yet, Ontario recently canceled its climate polluter pay system and most other programs to reduce fossil fuel use. Without effective government action to conserve energy, especially fossil fuels, Ontario will continue to damage its finances, climate, and well-being. On the energy conservation front, what measures would you like to see the Ontario government put in place to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, absolutely. As Courtney has already said, we know that there are only three big tools that reduce pollution. Putting a price on pollution, when pollution's free, you get more of it. And we've got really good experience with that in Ontario. And cap and trade worked remarkably well in Ontario in the short period of time we had it. We have to have money to invest in solutions, and that's again what a carbon tax or cap and trade can provide, is money to invest in solutions. And again, that's what we saw in Ontario, is that all the money was going into solutions. And the only other tool we have is regulation, which is generally more expensive but can work. So those are the three tools that work. And right now, and we were on the track to doing all of them, and right now we're not really doing any of them.
Did you want to add anything to what Courtney said about the fear and the well-being?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I brought a chart was just how much we're seeing in terms of actual insured losses in Ontario. And well, then you can see it there. I mean, this has not got any inflation in it. It's adjusted for inflation. It's adjusted for the wealth effect. These are real changes that we're starting to see, just as climate change is taking off, right? It's just starting to get going. It's not that we've reached a new normal. And so people are starting to see the impacts. People are starting to be able to see in their own lived experience that the world is changing in really scary ways. And it's not that we've reached a new normal, it's that the instability is just starting to accelerate. So of course that's frightening. And we all would dearly like it not to be true. I mean, every climate scientist in the world, I think, would be incredibly grateful if climate change was a hoax, because it is so scary and it's going to affect everything we care about. But having said that, if we give up, there really isn't any hope. So if we care about the future, this is the most important task we've got. We need to be working on it. We all need to be working on it. Pretending it's not happening isn't going to make it any better.
And I guess when we're communicating it, I think terminology also might get in the way. For example, Greg, one criticism of the public discussion of climate change is that sometimes we confuse climate and weather. Can you draw the distinctions for us, please?
Sure, and that is a confusion that you see a lot. You know, you read these things or hear these things that, you know, there's a cold day and someone says, well, see, obviously climate is not changing because it's cold outside. Well, weather is the day-to-day variability that is with us, has always been with us, and will continue to be with us. So in the future, as the climate warms, we will still see hot days and cold days and wet days and dry days and warm years and cold years and so on. The difference between weather and climate is that climate is the long-term average of those conditions. And it is that long-term average that is changing as a result of the changes in composition in the atmosphere, the increases of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that cause more heat to be trapped near the surface, causes more warming. That warming has many other implications on the water cycle, on snow, on ice, on various things. So one of the ways that I like to describe it is thinking about dice. You know, everyone has thrown a dice. And if you just throw a proper die, you will get a 6 sometimes, you'll get a 1 sometimes, you'll get a 2 sometimes, and they will be equally distributed. It's a fair dice. Now, if you start to load that dice a little bit, you will still get 1s and 6s and 2s and 4s, but if you load it in a particular way, you will start to get more 6s and less 1s. And the more you load the dice, the more 6s and less 1s that you will get. And that's what we see in many of these extremes. The average is changing, the hot extremes are getting hotter, the cold extremes are getting less cold. And that's so there's still cold days and hot days, but the averages are changing, and then as a result, those extremes change along with them.
Dianne, a moment ago you mentioned insurance, and there's been some controversy over the insurance industry's connection to university research. And I was speaking in this instant about the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. Should we be concerned that we might be getting skewed data?
Well, we should always be concerned whether we're getting skewed data, but the people we're getting skewed data from right now are certain political parties, not from the universities. I think we're really lucky that in this case, the insurance companies have been willing to put some money up in terms of how do we reduce the damage that climate change is already starting to cause, because you saw from the chart, it's already well over $1 billion.
But you can see why people could be skeptical, right? Because they stand to gain. And
well, but you see, I think that's wrong. The suggestion that insurance companies stand to gain, by studying climate change is completely backwards to me. Insurance companies are paying heavily, but insurance companies are not charities. They just raise their rates. Right? They're not worse off when there's more damage. In fact, in some ways, they're better off.
So why would they want it studied if they're gaining from what's happening?
I don't see that there's anything particularly in it for them. It seems to me that they can see better than maybe many other people that, in fact, the climate hammer is starting to hit, and the government is not paying attention to how it hits and what needs to be done. And they also have a hands-on familiarity with how this really ravages people's lives and how hard it is for people to recover. So, you know, I don't see that. This isn't like sugar companies sponsoring research on why we should eat more sugar. This is just about how do we make our houses more resilient? How do we reduce the economic damage? Because it's getting out of control, and it's not just homes. One of the things the Insurance Bureau pointed out earlier this year, they paid $1.3 billion last year. Well, for every billion they pay in losses, we're probably suffering $3 billion in damage to public infrastructure, the stuff we all own together. And there's no money to fix that. So we should certainly be paying attention to the source of the data, whether it's legitimate, whether it's justified. And that was one of the great things about my office before we were eliminated. It was our job specifically to provide nonpartisan data because people are wondering who they can trust. But I've looked closely at the Intact Center reports, and I haven't seen anything to doubt in them.
I want to go back to terminology for a quick second, Courtney. The Guardian newspaper in the UK recently decided to change the language it uses when it's discussing climate change. They now use the term climate crisis. And the phrase global heating will replace global warming. How important do you think these changes will be?
Well, I think it is important to speak of an urgent situation in urgent terms. And so I think that that's what they're doing, and they're hoping that that will sort of help people move past this apathy to action. And so I think that the thing we need to be careful of right now with all of this very urgent language is that our plans match the urgency of the language, of the diagnosis that we're making. So, you know, in the emerge, if we call a code blue, we don't go for coffee. You know, like that means, an emergency means you drop what you're doing, you come, we need all hands on deck, we need to help fix the situation. And so in this time of wildfires and, you know, causing smoke exacerbations and asthma exacerbations and heat-related illness and Lyme disease marching across Canada and people in the north falling through unstable ice, you know, this is an emergency. We have a small time window in which to act, but we need plans that match the urgency of what we're using in our language. And so, you know, the Committee on Climate Change in the UK has just produced a report that's itemized plan on how the UK could get to net zero by 2050. Like, that's the kind of thing we need to do to match the urgency of the language we're using. If we just change the light bulbs, we miss our one chance to have used this language and gotten the result that we want out of our populations and, you know, the healthy future we want.
Dianne, what do you think? Because I think some people might think this is alarmist by changing the language.
Well, scientists have been politely warning us for 30 years, right? The very same 30 years in which half of the climate pollution that's ever occurred has been dumped in the atmosphere has been, well, scientists have been telling us these very same things, and it hasn't worked. Most people have not responded. So I think we do need the language. I'm a strong supporter of municipal climate emergency declarations, and Canada's a world leader on this. And now what we need, exactly as Courtney has said, is for governments at all levels to recognize this is the largest emergency we face and take appropriate action. So we see Vancouver, for example, they've just passed their climate emergency response plan, where they are making serious changes to how municipal government operates and what they're trying to achieve, and we need to see that right across Canada. What we see right now is that places that have had an emergency, they've had a flood or a fire, whatever, are starting to wake up, and the places that haven't had one yet think, don't worry, we can just adapt. But we can't. We have now to do both two difficult things, both to avoid the unmanageable, because if we continue to pollute the climate the way we are, it's going to be unmanageable. And we have to manage the unavoidable, because we've already done so much damage and more is locked in. And there is no time to waste. People don't see it yet because our lives haven't changed very much yet, unless you happen to be one of the thousands of people who've been affected by a fire or a flood or a windstorm or Lyme disease or one of those sort of things. But those numbers are growing, and for all the rest of us, it's just a matter of time. And we have a fairly, as Courtney says, we have a fairly short window to change the direction. And the crazy thing is, we'd be better off if we did it. We would have better public health. We would have a better economy. We would have more local jobs. We would be draining less money out of the economy. We would be better off by reducing our fossil fuels. And here in Ontario, which is what I studied, we import essentially all our fossil fuels. 75% of our economy is dependent on imported fossil fuels. That's $16 to $25 billion that we drain out of the economy every year. So we are locking ourselves to a bad old economy whose future is really in doubt, and giving up the opportunity to build a new economy that also gives us a chance to survive. Just after Ontario tore up our price on carbon, the economists of the world awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics to who? William Nordhaus, for proving that having a price on carbon is the best thing if you care about your economy.
This is why we wanted to have this conversation, to separate the fact from the fiction. And Greg, I just wanted to bring you back into this. Is there any plan for your organization to toughen up the language when we're talking about the climate crisis?
It's always a difficult thing for scientists. So Dianne kind of alluded to this. As scientists, we've been studying climate for a long time. Personally, I've been working in this area for almost 30 years now, and our role, and I believe that it's our role, is to be objective and concrete and lay out the facts and lay out our understanding. And I think it's a challenge for many scientists, and many of my colleagues are struggling with this challenge as to how much to get into a mode of being perceived as activists, but retain your credibility as an objective scientist. That's a fine line that one has to walk. But I think the facts speak to the urgency by themselves, and there are many. The observational fact that the climate is warming, the physical understanding of why it's warming due to emission of greenhouse gases. The important one for me is the fact that it's so very nearly irreversible. That is, the amount of carbon that we put into the atmosphere stays in the atmosphere for many centuries. So even if we stopped emissions altogether today, the warming that we have already experienced is locked in for centuries. And so we don't. That's a message that I think is not well enough understood by people, is that it's the what we've already done is locked in, and every increment that we continue to put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere increases temperature, and that will remain for a long time unless we can implement technological strategies to actually take it back out of the atmosphere, which is very expensive. It's much more reasonable to avoid putting it in than taking it out. So it's those kind of things that make it seem urgent and compelling to me, and I guess the communication of that is, and the motivation for that has to come from others. I think from a scientific perspective, what we can do is present those cold hard facts and let them speak for themselves, or let others reiterate their importance and urgency.
Courtney, I want to end with you. Climate change can seem like a problem that's beyond individual action. Is there a piece of advice that you can give to people who want to do something, but they don't know what that is?
So we're seeing particularly with all the kids strikes, and we know that more are coming. There's going to be a big one in September. A lot of parents are newly getting this message from their children, via Greta Thunberg. And so we're seeing a whole new group of people who are really interested in taking action. So
and that's the young lady from Europe, right?
Yeah, who's this incredible communicator and just really lays out like, look, we need to do something now. And so things we can do in our personal lives that are good for health as well as for the climate are move to a more plant-rich diet, which is exactly what Canada's new food guide has recommended to us, which is amazing. We can try to get to where we're going on our own 2 feet. So cycling actually reduces mortality. There are very few things that do. Like I couldn't give anybody a pill that reduced mortality other than maybe, like some kind of a vitamin. So, cycling, walking, and what's great about that is you get into nature, so then you get the health benefits of nature, you get to see your community. Also, healthy energy. So how can we make electricity in a way that doesn't create this air pollution that gives people asthma exacerbations and reduces the length of their life? And so something we did in my community in Yellowknife was we had a solar panel co-op a couple of summers ago. And so we got together, we had some potlucks, we figured out who needed which solar panels, we did a bulk buy. So we saved ourselves money, we built community, we have like sort of new bling in our neighborhood, and it lets our kids know that we care about their future. So those things are super important, but really like we need to change the system so it's just easier for people to make healthier choices in a cheaper way. And so we do that by voting. So in the summer, people are going to be, starting to talk about the election, and it's really important that on this particular election, Canadians let our political parties know that it is unacceptable to do anything other than have a plan that gets us a healthy response to climate change. Like it's not the time for anything other than, an itemized plan that will have the result that we need so we can provide a healthy future to our kids. So having those conversations with your friends, having those conversations with your friends and family, letting your kids know that you care and that you're working for their health and safety, I think that's gonna, give us a lot to enjoy this summer and have us, give us the vision of the healthy, hopeful future that we all want.
And with that, I thank you all so much for making some time for us tonight. We've all learned so much from you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having us.
It was great.
And thank you, Greg.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario, and by viewers like you. Thank you.